Ghostwire Tokyo is a game that upon its release seemed to fade into obscurity rather quickly. With very few reviews on the game after its release period, I thought I would take a look at the game that had me intrigued by its visuals alone. Welcome to my retrospective review on Ghostwire Tokyo. First off, the game's version of Shibuya is great looking. I find each area of it feels unique from one another in terms of what the area would actually be used for. In the game, the whole population of Shibuya vanishes in an instant, and the game does a good job of conveying this visually. Buggies left in the street, cars abandoned, and most notably, clothes where people once stood all over the place. Although many of these assets are the same if you look at each one individually, and trust me, it's very easy to find the same set of clothes twice, I do find that the game still does enough to show how alive the city once was. I would go as far as to say that purely for a city exterior, this is the greatest I have seen in a played video game to date, up there with something like Night City from Cyberpunk. This is something I dislike as I am terrified of heights. That being said, the lack of interactive things in the environment really hinder the game. No mini-games to play, like in Yakuza, or a single random event really hinders the game's world. I'm not expecting Red Dead Redemption 2 levels of random events, especially since there's not meant to be any people. But instead of side missions that are static, how about make them feel like random events? This would at the very least make the world feel more interesting. Also in a similar vein, the game uses a trick, as many others do, to give the illusion that a building has an interior even though it doesn't. But after a while it does get rather annoying that you have this huge area of Tokyo with a well-made exterior that has nothing going on the inside. Still on the topic of interiors, I do dislike how you cannot fast travel from an interior location. It's not the biggest deal, as it rarely is an issue because of the previously mentioned lack of interiors, and most, if not all interiors, are extremely small. But I still found it silly. Parts of the world also don't seem to look very much like the areas they're based off. I see this game's version of Tokyo as a different city entirely from the one it claims to be based off. I will leave a video below comparing the two cities side by side for you to see. They should have done what Rockstar does and base the city on a real one, but give it a fictional name and lore. Some areas may look very similar, and maybe even the same for a particular building or two, but overall, especially in the less populated areas, it isn't really the same city. I feel if you ask a Tokyo citizen, they would say something similar, although this is just my speculation as I don't know anybody that lives in Tokyo personally. The rain is a constant throughout the game, which made me rather happy. That being said, as a rain connoisseur myself, I do find the rain to look poor, considering how realistic the game is wanting to look. The rain has a cool little detail, I suppose, where it's actually the Japanese character for the word rain. And although that may seem like a really cool detail at first glance, it does make the rain look worse as a result. The ability for Shibuya to accommodate traversal is done rather well. I never felt bored traversing the world. That being said, sometimes a player would struggle to get over obstacles he can seemingly get over at a different location. I think the game would have benefited more from a parkour system like something found in Dying Light, for example. You also have the ability to glide in the game, but this is limited to 2 seconds and can later in the game be upgraded to 5 seconds. This limit to the glide is neither in my mind a negative nor a positive. I can understand both arguments for it having a time limit or not. The glide is done well enough, and is the only part of the parkour I would not really care to alter. You can also use the Japanese legends Tengu to grapple your way up to higher altitudes. Their addition fits in the world's lore, as you may see later, and their inclusion is also useful. They are also spread out rather well, with their only negative being a constant screech that is pointless, as if you really want to use one, just look up to see if one is there. There is no need for an audio cue, especially one that loud. I mean, just look at the gameplay here I was trying to capture, and in the background you can just hear the screeches. Parts of the map are covered in fog early on, and this is the game's way of making you not be able to explore the entire map instantly. And like many games, there is a tower system in this game called Torii Gates, which allows you to clear up some fog, thus clearing up the parts of the map that you now can explore. Although many games use this tower-esque system, I find this game does it rather well, as not only do each gate feel unique in its location, they also range in difficulty, with most of them being very straightforward. That being said, I'm not the biggest fan of this system, as it feels like it's in every game now. However, this game's interpretation of it is fine. You can also be transported sometimes to these domains in which you need to fight a few waves of enemies, and this usually happens during side missions or in main missions. Well, actually, it always happens in these events. There's no, like I said, there's no random encounters where this happens. Gameplay-wise, these little sections are the same as the rest of the game, but visually, most look interesting enough and have a different feel to the main open world. When enemies throughout the world spot you, the streetlights also turn red, and it makes for a cool visual. This does get old after the 50th time, however. I also want to quickly point out how, although very useful, in this game the map to me looks kind of ugly. One very notable thing about Ghostwire Tokyo's gameplay is the weaving combat skills, which are what you're going to be seeing throughout the majority of this gameplay, as it is the main form of combat. There are 3 types: wind, fire and water. The 3 elemental types are unique enough from one another that you will end up using them all. Also, ammo, if you want to call it ammo, is limited, but can be recharged by destroying marked items throughout the world, and you'll see this in the gameplay as well. There'll be like a floating vacuum cleaner that you can punch and get these shards from that will recharge the abilities. That is all well and good, but my biggest issue with the weaving system is I don't believe there is enough moves you can perform. You have your standard attack for each of the 3 abilities, and then 1 additional ability each that you unlock via a skill tree. That is it. That is all the weaving abilities throughout the entire game. The abilities may look very cool, but with such a limited amount of choices in the main system of attack, you will end up getting bored after the 7th hour of playing. Once an enemy is almost at death's door, you have a chance to end it instantly with a core ripping move. This is cool to look at, and can be done to multiple enemies at once, but this really isn't weaving and it never changes. Other than weaving, another part of the combat is talismans. These are a cool addition, and rather expensive if you try to buy them outright. You can get them as rewards for doing certain quests, however. All of the talismans are a good addition. They act as a part of your equipment and feature abilities such as a flashbang, and not all of them are even combat related. There's one that creates a gust of wind, which makes you be able to glide from higher ground in an instant. All of the talismans are a good addition, and although the game is rather easy, they are a welcomed addition to gameplay. Another option you have for attacking is a bow. You were given this very early on in the game, and it's another what's classed as equipment. It is very strong compared to your weaving abilities, but it has no auto-aim like your weaving does, and has a very limited amount of ammo. The ammo can be upgraded in the skill tree, but you still get a very limited amount even then. You go from 10 arrows to maxing out at 20 arrows. While this sounds like I am bashing the bow, I am wanting to do the opposite, as I find the bow to be very well balanced. I didn't use it much as my aim with it was atrocious, but it can be useful and is deceptively strong. Speaking of the bow, there are a few moments in the game you lose your powers of weaving, and thus have to be more stealthy. The bow is still usable here, but as it is very limited in ammo, stealth is usually your best option in these moments. These power loss sections are fine and fit in with the story, but they pose such little challenge, you almost forget these sections ever happen. These moments aren't bad, but they aren't done well either, with the only exception being a boss fight against a cat where you need to sneak behind it 3 times. Although very simple, like all of the combat in this game, the story elements and look of the creature make it the best powerless section of the game. Now you can seal enemies or help people trapped by performing a hand seal. You can perform these with the touch on the PS5 controller's touchpad. Now this seems like it would be pretty cool, but as I realised later on in the game, you can have the game automatically do any of these for you without being penalised. So my question is, what is the point? Allowing the game to do it for you is fine, as I got stuck on one where I had to draw a star, but surely there should be some sort of punishment to the player, like less souls harvested or something. But because there isn't, you should just save yourself a few seconds and let the game do it for you, especially as the touchpad can be rather finicky at times. As mentioned there, in this game you collect souls. These are souls of the people who suddenly vanished in Shibuya. This is a major part of the game and is unavoidable, as they are not only absolutely everywhere, but you can also exchange them for XP. Now this is the fastest and easiest way to get XP, bar none. For just collecting a handful of these souls, you'll get much more XP than you will for doing an entire mission. Collecting these souls, both lore-wise, but also for something to do-wise, would have been fine if it wasn't for the sheer amount you have to collect. To 100% the game, you need to collect them all, and it is for that reason alone I didn't attempt to 100% the game. But they do take seconds to collect, and you can collect them while actively partaking in missions, which is pretty much where all the ones I collected were. It was either me running to missions or actively in missions in which I collected them. Very rarely did I go out of my way, if ever, to find them. Stealth in the game is fine. Aside from a really cool drop attack you can unlock in a skill tree, the stealth is just simply fine. I have no major negatives, as unlike Metal Gear Solid 5, the game doesn't need a more advanced stealth system, but what we got was still just meh. In Ghostwire Tokyo you have what is akin to an ultimate ability that is not particularly interesting. It simply makes you stronger for a period whilst also giving you ammo back for your weaving abilities, the latter of which is the only reason I ever used it, and it still was extremely rare. I believe I must have used it less than 10 times for the entire game. Also, the constant pulsing when it is ready to use is ugly and unnecessary as it turns yellow when usable. Lastly, to avoid attacks you can either block them, perfect block them, or dodge them. The dodge is unlocked in the skill tree and is uninteresting. It's perfectly acceptable, but nothing worth breaking down. The perfect block, however, is rather poor. The animations of enemies are not done well in interaction with you blocking, as attacks can't be choreographed well, as enemies' attacks can be instant and random. You need to block when it looks like the attack has already happened, and not just before on some enemies, and with others you have to block extremely early. The animations of enemies alone aren't bad, but when taking them into account for perfect blocks, it is abysmal. It does seem relatively useless, especially as you can just stay far away from most enemies, and you'll never want to get up close and personal anyway, so it just seems rather pointless, the block. It never felt used. They should have replaced the perfect block with the dodge and have the LB button be the dodge button instead. As the dodge button, you have to click in the moving analog stick, the left analog stick, but you can only dodge left, right, or behind. You can't dodge forward because that would just make you sprint. But having the LB or L2 button, or is it L1 button? Let me just check on the PS4 controller. The L1 button be the dodge instead, I think would make more sense. As I touched on earlier, there is in fact a skill tree. I feel two ways about the skill tree. On one hand, it doesn't feel like it's shoved in with absolutely no thought to check a more content box. That being said, there is a lack of anything interesting to unlock. Aside from a single weaving ability for each of your 3 elemental weaving abilities, there is only the standard stuff like faster attack or longer glide duration. You can collect souls faster, etc. When looking at other games with skill trees, this one is so very disappointed in comparison. The player can also equip prayer beads, which are a simple stat boost. They're pointless to dive into, but they're fine, I suppose, and the way you unlock them is by doing the Torii gates, which I mentioned earlier. One thing I did like is how spread out the enemies are. When fighting, I rarely, if ever, thought there were too many enemies, and the enemies are very well spread out throughout the game. I was not constantly running into enemies every corner I turned. The design of the enemies are also cool. In fact, I believe they come from Japanese mythology. Sure, after hours of playing they do start to become more and more boring, but I do feel the enemy designs, while nowhere near as good as something like the Cherry Blossom monster from Silent Hill: The Short Message, are solid throughout. What is even more impressive though, is some enemies' unique environmental effects. You have the Kuchisake Owner that makes the world around it rusted and leaves the world looking like a Chiller's art game. You also have the Shine Dancer, which if raining will make the rain go up instead of down when engaged in combat, and I actually believe that this one is actually based on a doll that Japanese kids in real life hang outside to ward off the rain, so it actually makes sense as well as to why the rain goes up. There are a few other examples of enemies affecting the world, but these are my favourite 2. That being said, sometimes they don't always trigger, which is a bit peculiar, but overall I really do like the elemental effects from some enemies. And it is worth mentioning that not every enemy has these effects. That being said, I can understand why the Slenderman looking enemies or the school children looking enemies don't have these effects, because they're the most common enemies by far, and it would probably be overstaying its welcome if it happened with every single enemy. The only enemy in the game I genuinely dislike, not necessarily in design, but just in combat, is this umbrella thing. It is an airborne menace. Now I'm half joking, as I feel like this is just because I'm bad and I feel this way. However, I did find them to be the worst enemies in the game by far, although, thankfully, in my playtime they were extremely rare, one of the rarest enemies in the entire game. Very briefly, I'd like to mention the flashlight in this game, which is utterly pointless. Not only does it barely affect the world around it, but it takes up a slot on the D-pad which could have been used for literally anything else. This game also has the issue of having items you can sometimes pick up, but sometimes can't, as this specific one is for set decoration. It's not a big issue at all, but I always get a little chuckle when I see this in a game, and it is very common in games. You take no fall damage in this game, which is a great choice as you spend a lot of time on rooftops and there is no reason to punish the player for falling in this game. There is also not a long animation getting back up on your feet, which is appreciated. Throughout the world are shops run by cats, and they're all very well balanced for the amount of money you will have at each state in the game. There are different types of places to buy items like vending machines, stores, merchants, and most notably convenience stores. They are all balanced rather well and are plentiful throughout the world. The amount of convenience stores, which is probably accurate to Tokyo, but the amount of convenience stores you can find, they are very numerous and they are balanced very, very well. I think they've done rather well. Also, I want to briefly mention that throughout my experience, my FPS was perfect. I can't remember there being a single FPS drop. Don't get me wrong, there shouldn't be FPS drops in a game. I'm not, this isn't necessarily a huge positive. I also had no glitches throughout my experience that come to mind. Although I don't class this game as horror, there are enough attempts at it that I felt it was worthy to talk about. So let me go through a few of the attempts at horror throughout the game. First off, we have this shadow of the schoolgirl enemies that you can find within multiple locations, although it is relatively rare. It may seem a little creepy, but it always has less enemies than the shadow would have you believe. It's also not as scary as it could have been, as the locations you see this in are out in the open. Imagine seeing this in an interior, it would have been so much better. Next we have this mirror scare that was in a side mission that I will speak on later. It's a cool idea and it's definitely unexpected, but as cool as I think this little secret is, it is not that scary, it's just cool. Then we have this main mission unmissable scare from an enemy. This is not utterly horrific and is better than an out of the blue terrible jump scare that I'll get into in a minute. But is it really that scary, especially when you fight and beat them straight after? Speaking of that awful out of nowhere jump scare, I give you a jump scare warning. This jump scare is utterly horrendous. Ghostwire Tokyo is not Layers of Fear. This scare could easily make people jump as this is not the game they're expecting this from. That may sound like a compliment, but it is not. Even in fully fledged horror games, I hate the random out of nowhere jump scares, with no build up, just to get a cheap jump from the audience. This scare is the definition of an awful jump scare. Also, this mission starts by hearing Sid playing some music, or was it Shadow? And lastly, I want to get onto the best scare in the game. The Weeping Angel section with a school science mannequin. Let me play it out in its full in-game sequence.
なんだ今の見ただけで体に痛みが走った。ああ、俺も感じた。とんでもねえ奴が嫌がるぞ。気をつけろ。この汚れを浄化しないと進めねえな。よし、これで進めるぞ。追ってきてる？追ってきてるよね。
From the build-up to the scare, and then when you think it's all over, it turns out to be a weeping angel. The only good horror in this entire game is this right here, and it is really good. I would go as far as to say it's one of my favourite video game scares in recent memory. Side missions in Ghostwire are done relatively well, I think. Some take over 20 minutes, while others literally take less than a minute. I am so very glad there are little, if any, fetch quests. That being said, aside from one exception, none of the side missions are riveting by any means. But compared to its contemporaries, I feel Ghostwire Tokyo does okay in this department. Quests are given by spirits, and I find their voice acting unique enough from one another that I could believe they were once different people. Although, like mentioned earlier, the quests are very static in their location, and you unlock them by unlocking Torii gates, which unlocks more of the map, which then just they show up on the map as like, oh, side mission. None of them are discovered naturally throughout the game. The side mission that is my favourite is definitely the Hanako-chan school mission, which I actually believe was DLC for the game, but I could be wrong there. It is the mission that includes not only the Weeping Angel section, but also the mirror scare from earlier. And it's actually good. The only major complaint I have with this mission is the final confrontation with Hanako is rather lacking. It's just fight 4 waves of enemies and finish. But overall this mission is one of the best in the game, even including main quests. I also want to give a little mention to the Kisaragi Station side mission as well. This one has you stop at a small town train station and just fight enemies, and although that doesn't sound riveting, it's one of the more unique side missions in the game. There are also many Easter eggs on this side mission that I later found by watching a YouTube video, which I will link in the description below. Not all is good, however. There is a side mission that has this cool looking old Japanese home that has a boss fight with an ice lady. The visuals here look cool, but the fight was so very terrible, it was so disappointing. You fight her as part of the main story as well, and she is just as disappointing. She just turns the stage fully into ice, which is the only real move she has, and then just dies rather easily. I think she can also shoot ice at you, but she was terrible. There are also quite a few side missions and main missions that involve protecting something, so protect someone with only a bow, protect this dog, protect this lady. It does seem quite numerous, and although never difficult to do, they could have toned it down. The main reason I feel this way about these types of missions is because throughout the open world, you can stumble upon souls that are like being trapped by enemies. It is the only real, if you even want to call it, random event feeling thing throughout the entire game, and you can choose to ignore it completely if you really wish, but if you choose to save them all, it would definitely get boring after a while. Collectibles are plentiful in this game, from praying to upgrade the amount you can use your weaving, to little trinkets that have cool references. There are so very many. This game has both collectible files and audio tapes. Now, although I usually do not like this, in this game they are purely for world building and not needed to understand the main story. Aside from the previously mentioned souls, if you can even count them as collectibles, none of the collectibles are poor and serve as set dressing to the world's lore. I would have preferred if they went for more of a visual storytelling method, more than just the collectibles, but for what it is, the files and audio logs are absolutely fine. As much as I didn't mind the side missions, I must say I really didn't enjoy the main story. The story involves protagonist Akito, who dies, then gets possessed by a spirit named KK, not his government name. KK brings him back to life, and Akito gains KK's powers. Then humans in Shibuya all disappear unexpectedly, and Akito, rushes to the hospital to check up on his dying sister Mari. She then gets kidnapped by the main antagonist Henya, who was the one who made everyone disappear in the first place, and the one you'll probably see on a lot of artwork with, like, he's the one that's like got the devil mask on or demon mask. He plans to use Mari to bring back his dead wife by merging the world of the living and the dead. On the way to save Mari, you meet a friend of KK's who was possessed by a villain, so tricked you, but then you defeat the villain to free her, and then by the end, you stop Henya, but your sister ends up ultimately dying. I know I just summed up the story extremely quickly there, but that's because I really didn't find it very good. First of all, Akito goes from being extremely scared at the start of the game, when first possessed, to utterly fine so quickly it's honestly shocking. Within a few hours, he is already acting the way he would by the end of the game. But at the end of the game, in a cutscene in which he meets his dead parents, he acts as if he has learned in that moment to keep on going. His personality hasn't changed for the vast majority of the game, and now he pretends to be a changed man. There is also a memory sequence right before he meets his parents, after you defeat the final boss, which is simply awful. It is simply there for two reasons. The first is to lore dump you with information you already knew, such as his parents being dead, but also to try to get a cheap tear out of you, as the memories involve his sister, who is dead in the next scene. I hate lore dumps at the best of times, but when not only do we know everything important in the lore dump already, but the attempt at cheap tears to try to make you feel for a character that has been mediocre at best makes it even worse. Also, since Akito literally died at the start of the game, would it not have made sense for him to die at the end? I understand his sister was already in hospital before the events transpired in the game, but it would have been better if he died alongside his sister, no? Also, what are the chances that the only person left in Shibuya has his sister as the main antagonist's plan? Now, if I'm not understanding this perfectly, please do correct me, but I believe the reason his sister is in the antagonist's plans is because she's like, I don't know if she's in purgatory necessarily, but she's in like the balance between life and death. Like, she's dying, but she's not quite dead yet, so she's like half dead, half alive, or something like that, I believe. That's why she's important to the story, although he probably could have chose anybody else besides her, but apparently she's a good vessel. But it just seems to all fall into place too perfectly. I was genuinely more interested during the Hanako side mission story than the entire main story. The main antagonist was simply humorous without meaning to be. Listen to this.
新世界の導き手になれるかもしれない。新世界のマリア。いや、イブか。
When he said that, for the first time in the game and the only time, I audibly burst out laughing. But I suppose at least he's entertaining. Throughout the game he also speaks to you on the screens of Shibuya, as if he's Scarecrow and you're Batman. These speeches are whatever and repeated often enough, but anytime he speaks I either smile, as I find it silly, or I find him terribly boring. Never did I watch a cutscene involving him with the emotion the developers probably wanted. There isn't enough in this game to theorycraft either, so the little things touched upon are just not that interesting. And this is mainly because the story's so poor, so why would you want to theorycraft anyway? And quite often in the game, there are cutscenes that are slightly too long at times, and as I didn't find the story particularly interesting, I skipped halfway through a lot of them. Like as soon as it got about halfway through, I just ended up skipping the cutscene entirely. That all being said, the Japanese voice acting seemed really solid throughout, although I do not speak fluent Japanese. I didn't play the game in English. I have heard the English voice acting is poor, and I've heard little snippets from other people's videos on the game, but I am unsure about the English voice acting in general because I didn't play the game in English. There are a few boss fights throughout the game. Almost all of them were poor, aside from the one without powers where you have to sneak behind the cat, and I only found that cool because the cat looks cool. The final boss especially is a joke. I don't care as much about the difficulty as I do about cool moves or interesting design, but the boss was rather poor in its attacks and design, and it wasn't anything stand out for what the main antagonist's boss should be. During the rest of this review I will play some of the other main story boss fights for you, because although they are quite poor, I don't want to dive into each one individually. I just want to get past the story section because I really didn't find the story interesting at all. So non-interesting, in fact, if that is a word. If I was to go extremely in-depth with the whole review, I'm sure I'd find many more positives and negatives. Like a negative of mine would be that the tutorials stay on screen for far too long at times. But overall I found the game to be a solid try for anyone who can either get it for free or for over like 50% off. Who knows, maybe you would like it or do like it more than I do. It's not my cup of tea personally, but the game is not bad at all. My only advice personally would be if you're looking for a story-driven game, I wouldn't go with this, simply due to the fact that I do not believe the story to be very good at all. However, to each their own. Maybe you've heard what I've been talking about and you may love the story, or maybe you've played the game before and you love the story. It's completely your choice, but I do appreciate you for watching this video, this critique on the game, and yeah, thank you very much.